Okay, Xavier.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. And welcome to the book launch for the reissue of Steve Miller's book, State and Society in 18th-Century France, a study of political power and social reproduction in Languedoc, which has been published last year by Haymarket, available on the website. You should check it out. I'm Xavier LaFrance. I'm professor of political science at the University of Quebec in Montreal, and I will be your host for tonight's event. We have about 90 minutes to an hour and 45 minutes for the event tonight. And we have with us as panelists, obviously, first Stephen Miller, who's professor of history at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. He is the author of the book on the discussion tonight. Also, he's the author with Christopher Isett of the Social History of Agriculture, which was out in 2017, and of Feudalism, Venality and Revolution. He's co-author with myself of The Transition to Capitalism in Modern France, published last year. Then we will have two commentators. First, Paul Cheney, who's a professor of European history at the University of Chicago, and who specializes in old regime France and its colonial empire. He has taught at Columbia University, the European College of Liberal Arts in Berlin, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Queen's University in Belfast also. He's the author of Revolutionary Commerce, Globalization in the French Monarchy, out in 2010, and also more recently of Cul-de-sac, Patrimony, Capitalism, and Slavery in French Saint-Domingue, out in 2017. And then we will have Kent Wright, who's an associate professor at the Faculty of History at the History at Arizona State University. He's the author of Classical Republican in 18th Century France, the political thought of Madley. And also he has a forthcoming book on the Revolutionary Atlantic, forthcoming with Cambridge. So without further ado, Steve, you have the virtual floor.
Okay.
We'll go for 20 minutes.
Okay. So I would like to thank Historical Materialism, Brill, and Haymarket for the chance to have this discussion on my book, and Kent Wright, Paul Cheney, and Xavier LaFrance for participating. These three outstanding scholars have encouraged and helped me more than I could say in my academic career. So I'm not going to explain the details of the content of the book because I want people to feel like they need to buy it and read it. So I'm going to go over how I came to this project. This is a revised and updated edition of a book that was published in 2008, and that book came out of my dissertation, which was conceived and developed in the 1990s. And at that time, university history departments still held seminars on the origins of the French Revolution and revisionism. And when I took one of those seminars in the 90s, I learned that revisionists showed that those who carried out the revolutionary transformation and that the National Assembly, which carried out the revolutionary transformation and created a rational, uniform administration of the country, eliminated economic monopolies and tolls, abolished the first and second estates to establish legal equality and equal taxation, that they were not what one would think of as capitalists, not manufacturers or merchants, but office holders, possessors of non-capitalist proprietary wealth, people who lived off of rent. This was troubling for me at the time because I had been educated in the liberal and the Marxist tradition, both of which saw the French Revolution as a breakthrough for capitalism, a bourgeois revolution, which broke through the fetters of the feudal nobility and made it possible for capitalism to thrive and for representative government and constitutional government. It was about progress, which liberals and Marxists both believed. So in the summer after my first year at UCLA, I just picked up in the library, in the bookstore. I purchased a book by Verso, which I knew was a good publisher, George Communel, Rethinking the French Revolution, Marxism, and the Revisionist Challenge, a book which I still think bears reading. Now, Communel, he went over the trajectory of Marx's thought on the transition to capitalism, and then Marxist scholars and their commentaries on Marx and the transition to capitalism. And Communel showed that in the early part of Marx's early career, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, he described the origins of capitalism as the expansion of the market to the Atlantic world, that the growth of trade brought about capitalism. Whereas at the end of Marx's career, especially in Capital, most starkly in the last chapter, so-called primitive accumulation, Marx was clear that what was absolutely required for capitalism was an economic growth, was the dispossession of the peasantry, the separation of the peasantry from the land, so that the population of England became dependent on capital, and investors could turn labor power into additional capital. Now, Communel constantly mentioned Robert Brenner in his book, and my leftist colleagues in the graduate school at UCLA have long told me you have to take Brenner's seminar. So the next semester, I took a 20-week seminar with Robert Brenner, on economic development, 20 weeks. And what I got out of it was not only what Marx described in the last chapter of Capital, peasant dispossession, but also that the dominant class had to be separated from its ability to have non-economic means of obtaining wealth. Slavery had to be eliminated and serfdom eliminated. But not only these coerced forms of labor, but also venal offices, seigneurial rights, positions in tax farms, privileged access to lucrative sinecures in the church and in the royal court, so that no longer having access to these extra economic means of obtaining wealth, that the dominant classes would have to valorize their capital by employing labor power, the dispossessed peasantry, to turn their labor into additional capital. Not only that, but they would have to compete against other capitals to cut costs on the market, investing in production to improve labor power, and that this imperative of capitalism was the basis of modern sustained economic growth. At the same time, as I took that seminar with Brenner, there was a 20-week seminar with Perry Anderson on the great books of the Enlightenment. And I remember, it's always stayed with me throughout my academic career, that in going over the spirit of the laws, Brenner was clear that Anderson pointed out that Montesquieu made clear that the highest point of civilization, the best form of government, was the feudal monarchy of France. That the intermediary powers, which assured basic liberties, the safeguard against despotism, emerged out of the feudal past. That representative government itself emerged out of the feudal past. The estates led to representative government. They were the basis for the intermediate powers, moderate government, and that all this emerged out of feudalism. Now, Anderson didn't say it at the time, but this dovetailed well with one of the most famous phrases from his large body of work in Lineages of the Absolutist State, in which he characterized the absolutist states as redeployed and recharged apparatuses of feudal domination. So how did these influences then shape my thinking about the French Revolution? Well, the French Revolution was clearly a bourgeois revolution. It was made by well-to-do commoners, non-nobles, but also people who didn't work with their hands. But it was an ancien non-capitalist bourgeoisie. Its investments were in venal offices, land, positions in tax farms, offices in municipal government, investments in educational training to join the first estate, the clergy, or to become office holders in most of the tribunals of the realm. But it was a subordinate section of the dominant class below the top positions in the state, controlled by the nobility. It was the third estate made up of the majority of positions of public authority. They held most of the positions of public authority, but they were subordinate to the top positions of the nobility. But the question is, how would this one section of the ruling class why would it then lead a revolution against another section of it? Because after all, in a capitalist society, for example, the millionaire class, if it's inconceivable that it would lead a revolution against the billionaire class. But what's different about the old regime, monarchy, was that it was a state-centered ruling class permeated by all sorts of feudal and religious privileges and ranks and hierarchies, hallowed by the Catholic religious dogma. And the third estate was the bourgeoisie was locked into subordinate positions, and there was a great deal, and status and rank were very important, and it on a daily basis in its work within the state, in the courts and the clergy and municipal administrations, it clearly felt its subordination to the nobility. And even though the third estate could purchase positions with higher positions in the state and join the nobility, they bought those positions with the knowledge that there wouldn't be movement into those positions, that they would join a closed group. But of course, this still wouldn't lead the bourgeoisie to become revolutionary. What was also necessary was a crisis, collapse. And this is all also related to the economy and governing structure and political structure of France, because the basic economic characteristics of France, which I just outlined, a non-capitalist ruling class and a peasantry in possession of the land, was the exact opposite in England, if I could put things starkly. That the primitive accumulation, the last chapter of Marx's Capital, described England, the dispossession of the rural population of England, and the gentry as well, didn't have the same kinds of extra economic means of obtaining wealth through venal offices or positions in tax farms or sinecures within the upper echelons of the royal court. The gentry, dominant class of England, to reproduce itself, to obtain wealth, had to attract tenant farmers, and the tenant farmers, to pay to cover the leases to the gentry, had to produce competitively for the market against one another, and therefore had to cut costs by raising the labor productivity of their employees, the dispossessed peasantry, through investments in the latest technology in agriculture, which was convertible husbandry and investment in horses. So the English economy was much more productive than the French economy and had higher levels of growth and productivity. But at the same time, in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, put the gentry in control of the government through parliamentary sovereignty. And the gentry, by controlling parliament and guaranteed the British state debt for investors much more assuredly than would the absolutist arbitrary regime in France. So with a government which inspired more confidence and an economy that had more rapid rates of growth, England had much more revenue at its disposal to fund war against France. A much larger navy, subsidies to its allies, which were enemies of France, and England had military success in all of the major military confrontations from the time of Louis XIV at the end of the 17th century through the Napoleonic Wars, except for the American War of Independence, which bankrupted the French monarchy and forced the French monarchy to call the Estates General. And there, in crisis, when the whole social contract of France, when the constitutional system was up for renegotiation of the Estates General, then the third estate could perceive that its subordination to the nobility and the upper clergy would be assured for the future through what was decided at the Estates General. And there, the third estate could, within the Estates General, this non-capitalist ancien regime bourgeoisie, could start to develop grievances. But even then, there wouldn't have been a revolution had it not been for a massive social revolution, which I document in the book under question. First of all, the crisis of the absolute monarchy and the calling of the Estates General, the writing of Cahiers de Doléances, unleashed a massive desire for political participation, which spread through all ranks of society, and it lasted throughout the 1790s. People wanted to participate in government and challenge their exclusion because of possession of power in venal offices or privileged access to power through nobility. Um, but beyond that, the peasants carried through a social revolution against both the ancien regime, the bourgeoisie, and the nobility by refusing to pay taxes. I document in the book massive resistance to taxation across Languedoc from 1788 through 1789 through 1792, and even into the rest of the latter part of the 1790s and other parts of Languedoc. Peasants also brought down the seigneurial regime across Languedoc and France as well by invading manor houses, burning the seigneurial titles of the nobility, refusing to pay seigneurial dues. And peasants also attacked grain convoys, laying hold of surpluses and making sure that grain of subsistence was available in rural areas. So this massive social revolution forced the ancien regime bourgeoisie in the Estates General to react and carry through revolutionary policies, right? Equality before the law, a rational administration of the country, the elimination of privileges and the seigneurial regime, etc. All right. The last two issues I would like to discuss are the context, Languedoc, and the fact that this is a revised edition and therefore what it contains. Now, Languedoc, this large province in southern and southwestern France, has been the subject of some of the most important books on not only on French history, but of historiography in general, both of American historians and French historians. Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, a prominent member of the Annales School, his dissertation, Les Paysans de Languedoc, the peasants of Languedoc, right, about Languedoc. And I think that his thesis and his research coincides well with my book. He describes a peasant economy in Languedoc, that as population grew in peasant communities, the peasants had to extend production onto fallow lands, land used for grazing animals, wooded areas, and thereby undermined the ecological and mineral basis of farming. Leading to growth, but also crises and limits to growth over several centuries from about the year 1000 all the way to 1700s, the 14th century crisis in which agriculture collapsed, but also stagnation and crisis in the 17th century. So Leroy-Ladurie showed no growth in Languedoc, except for the 1700s. But at which time the economy and the population grew together. But he argues that he's clear that there was no agricultural revolution along the lines of Great Britain during the 18th century. But also, American historians have also written important books on Languedoc. Robert Schneider, Leonard Berlinstein, and Robert Forster. Now, Robert Forster wrote a very important book on the parlementaires of Toulouse, the high judges in Toulouse, some of the most important venal offices of France. And I think it's important because a lot of political Marxists who studied under Ellen Mason's Wood, I think, take too literally this idea of a tax office state. She's actually stated this in her work, and I've seen it stated in other publications of political Marxists, that the dominant class of France lived off of taxation, revenue from offices. That's empirically incorrect. And Forster shows in this book on some of the most important venal officers of France that they obtained very little revenue from their venal offices in the Parlement of Toulouse, that they obtained the great majority of their revenue, these high nobles in Languedoc, from their lands, from their sharecroppers, and from their tenant farmers. But he also shows that there were no gains in agriculture. He states clearly that there are no technical gains in agriculture. No gains no gains in agricultural productivity, no agricultural revolution. In fact, he calls the parlementaires of Toulouse, these high judges, grain lords, as if they dominated the market and extracted revenue from the people's need for grain. Leonard Berlinstein wrote another very important book, on the barristers of Toulouse. The mainstay, or the most important group, let's say, within the bourgeoisie of Toulouse, one of the most important cities of France in the old regime, a large city today. Now, he showed that these members of the bourgeoisie, the barristers of Toulouse, that they were also very attached to the Parlement of Toulouse. They didn't want to see it disappear. They didn't want a rational judicial layout for the country. They wanted to preserve their status within the Parlement of Toulouse. In fact, these members of the bourgeoisie, they didn't make a revolution, they survived it, which I think works well, which coincides again with my argument that uh, can everybody else hear me?
Yep.
Which I think works well with my argument that we don't have that one doesn't see a revolutionary capitalist bourgeoisie. Now, the last book on that I would like to point out from American historians is also one that's not only an important book for French history, but for historiography in general, a model of historical research on politics, economy, and society, which is of course, William Blake, Absolutism in Society in 17th Century France, State Power and Provincial Aristocracy in Languedoc, published in 1985. Blake famously argued that the creation of the absolutist state, the Sun King, Louis XIV's regime, was as much the creation of the nobility as it was of Louis XIV, that the nobility enforced Louis XIV's power in Languedoc and thereby upheld their own positions of status and power in Languedoc. That imposing Louis XIV's absolutism, that they enjoyed more power and prestige in Languedoc, and the tax revenue of Languedoc, which went through the nobility, and they reaped a large share of it before it was passed on to Louis XIV for his purposes, for war and his administration of the country. Now, my book is a sequel to, one could look at it as a sequel to William Blake's, how this absolutist state collapsed into social revolution at the end of the 18th century. And I would like to state that what I consider one of the biggest, greatest intellectual accomplishments of my academic career was not long after my book was published in 2008. I saw William Blake. He passed away in 2017, but maybe in 2009 or 2010 or 2011, I saw William Blake at a conference probably, or maybe I visited him in Atlanta. He was a professor at Emory, and he told me that my book, which was pretty much how he would have written it had he written a sequel to his own, which I took as a great compliment coming from William Blake. Now, lastly, this is a revised and updated edition, and the original book of State Mind, State and Society in 18th Century France, Study of Political Power and Social Revolution in Languedoc. It had some success. It was through this book that I met Kent Wright, and Kent Wright and Paul Cheney. The book was reviewed in about 12 journals. All the reviews were positive, except for Jonathan DeWald's review of my book in the American Historical Review. And he took me to task for not commenting upon and not dealing with what he argued was the most important book on French agriculture in the early modern period, Philip Hoffman's book, Growth in a Traditional Society. So in this revised and updated edition, I do discuss Philip Hoffman's book and my differences with it. Philip Hoffman, his argument is that the French economy, the early modern French economy, had as much potential for growth as did the English economy of the early modern period. But and he argued this by looking at what he called total factor of productivity, which is basically, by and large, a study of leases. As lease prices grow, that's an indication of growth of production, unlike Le Roy Ladurie, who used tithes as a measure of growth. Now, of course, what I argue in this revised and updated edition is that leases do not necessarily show economic growth. They can be indicative of extracting wealth from a dependent peasant population. But hopefully you'll read the book and see how I go over Hoffman's thesis. Now, the last thing I'll mention, this is how I'll conclude, is what's missing. This revised and updated edition, I did not take into consideration William Sewell's latest book, very important book, Capitalism and the Emergence of Civic Equality in 18th Century France. When his book came out on the market, mine, this revised and updated edition, had already gone into production. However, that's not an excuse because that doesn't exonerate me, because William Sewell had also published a couple of important articles which basically have the same thesis as Capitalism and the Emergence of Civic Equality. Sewell's argument is that capitalism was emerging in the interstices of the French feudal monarchy, and the emergence of capitalism changed the culture and made people amenable to the civic equality which was legislated in 1789. Now, I have dealt actually with the William Sewell's thesis. Xavier LaFrance and I just published another book, which I hope people will look at, The Transition to Capitalism in Modern France, in which we look carefully at Sewell's work. And while we admire his intellectual and cultural history, we disagree with his economic analysis. That we argue that the dominant classes were not dependent on the market to reproduce themselves. They dominated markets more rather than having to compete on them. And of course, the peasantry hadn't been dispossessed and wasn't dependent on capital. It didn't have to sell its labor power to capitalists. And so we don't see the emergence of capitalism. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Paul Cheney and Kent Wright. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot for that, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me to reread this wonderful book and to comment on it. Also in such excellent company. I'm really kind of honored by that. I mean, one thing that strikes me about rereading this book is that it really helps in some sense. I mean, I understand it better now with a sort of retrospect and clarification from Steve's subsequent work on the provincial assemblies and that wonderful book he wrote on the social history of agriculture that Xavier mentioned in his introduction. And the elements that he elaborates on in those two books are also present in his book State and Society. I was actually going to talk a little bit and lay out kind of Brennerite account. I think I'll go a little quickly on that because Steve did a really good job on that. I would say, and perhaps this reprises a little bit about what he said in response to what he says in response to Hoffman, but this is very much the Brennerite account of agriculture is very much in contrast to the sort of Smithian account offered by Philip Hoffman. And the idea there, and it's elaborated by other historians, and I'll talk about this much later on in my comment, is that urbanization is a prime driver of growth, and you can get gains to specialization just by the effects of proximate urban markets without necessarily heavy technological investment in technology or indeed even a wholesale reorganization of agricultural production. But one thing I think is worth pointing out, rather than kind of going over the Brennerite account altogether, is that, Brenner's initial intervention into this literature, it depended on this kind of contrast between, on the one hand, England, and on the other hand, Eastern Europe, east of the Elbe River. And then kind of between the two is this zone of Western Europe, France and kind of western part of Germany, where, peasants were protected in the possession of their property by, on the one hand, these kind of administrative agricultural monarchies, and on the other, the nobility themselves. Each of these, these institutions on the one hand and groups of people didn't want to kill the goose, as it were, that laid the golden egg. I mean, they were dependent on the revenues that were coming from a peasant-dominated agriculture. And in Steve's account, and not just in this book, but in a lot of other things, the overhanging contrast. I mean, there's an implicit contrast, I think, hangs over the entire book between Britain and France, or sort of fully capitalist Britain and essentially non-capitalist France. And I want to I want to come back to that later on. One thing that I think, and Steve, he alludes to this in his comments. I mean, there's a way in which, the value of this book, as steeped as it is in the Brennerite kind of Marxist account of agricultural development or economic development or lack thereof, despite that, Steve is actually, he accepts and does quite a lot with aspects of the revisionist account, which is basically a kind of anti-Marxist account. I mean, it was originally pitched against Marxist accounts of the revolution. And, so he accepts and does a lot with his observation by George Taylor that there's no sharp division in property holding among the dominant classes, the bourgeoisie or the nobility in France, and also that there were not necessarily sharp ideological divisions between these estates. Sometimes divisions could be stronger within these groups, within the nobility, for instance, or within the third estate, than conflicts were between these estates. And, Steve does a really good job in this book, and it's very enlightening to show the way in which conflict played out in the run-up to and then during the revolution. So on the one hand, you have the estates of Languedoc. These were nobles who collaborated very closely with the monarchy, and he shows that they did this because they got both material and symbolic rewards out of it. And oftentimes this collaboration with the monarchy meant that they were destituting local nobles and the bourgeoisie of their power. So the estates of Languedoc kind of moved against them. For the nobility, this meant, who were possessed of certain social and political power because of their landholding, notably the administration of justice. This meant a kind of destitution of that power. And for the bourgeoisie of Languedoc, this meant, municipal power and, power in municipal government, and also forms of social and political power that arose out of guilds and professional law of different kinds. So, again, thinking about Steve's subsequent work and rereading this book, I want to talk a little bit about, just this kind of specificities of how this Brennerite account, economic argument, how he uses this to explain the onset and unfolding of the French Revolution. As Steve mentioned, Brenner talks about non-capitalist agricultural relations as not leading to economic development, technological development. In France, you have in the 18th century population growth, and because of laws of equal inheritance, you have this steady, and Manuel Loiderie talks about this a lot in The Peasants of Languedoc. You have this steadily chopping up of a division of plots, right? And so they're essentially man-land ratios are growing during this era, this period. And so there's not necessarily any productivity gains happening at all. Basically, what peasant families are doing is piling more and more labor onto more or less the same area of land. They're gaining absolutely more product, but unquestionably, at least in this situation, there is a marginal decrease in productivity. One thing that actually this account made me think of, and just reading Steve in general makes me think of, and thinking about France is, there might be an interesting comparison to be made between this account and Geertz's account of involution in Java. I mean, there are a lot of French economists who are interested in looking at China, and I think that they saw a kind of parallel between their, very large and in some senses very wealthy economy and that of China. Both of these places are kind of teetering on the edge of a sort of an agricultural involution. And I think the story Steve tells is one of economic involution. At any rate, the story here is that this declining per capita production on land, especially as demographic growth pushes the peasantry out to increasingly marginal land, leads to decreased disposable income for consumption. Later, this would be called, the Labrousse effect, or an agricultural depression. Once prices go up, essentially, there's less and less disposable income to buy manufactured good. And this is obviously, in the long term, a restraint on the possibility of development of manufacturing. There's less income, even if peasants were indeed inclined to do this. There's less income for investment in land, and quite significantly less available surplus to divide among elites, be they noble or bourgeois. For the state, there's less surplus available for taxation in a context where there's a ratcheting up of commercial warfare, particularly with Britain. There are fewer offices, or these offices become less profitable, as Steve talks about, and a higher taxation of elites. The French elites actually pay quite a bit of taxes. Well, that's not quite the story we usually get, but that's quite true. I don't know. Does anybody read Jack Goldstone anymore? I mean, he had his book on revolution and rebellion in the early modern world. It tells a story of upward mobility, a closed path of upward mobility. He doesn't so much talk about stalled productivity growth, but he talks about how a closed path of upward mobility into the higher reaches of the elites can have very socially and politically destabilizing. I mean, arguably, there's a similar story going on in the United States right now. Maybe we could talk about that in the discussion. At any rate, Steve, I think he more or less accepts this revisionist account, but does something totally different with it, that the revolution starts from above and not below. But nevertheless, there is very quickly, as he shows in his book, and I think in a really convincing way, that there is an initial coalition between certain segments of the artisanate and the peasantry and the bourgeoisie on the one hand, but also that they as voters, as new voters, these people invest a lot of initial confidence in nobles, right? Again, there are a lot of unlikely coalitions that would arise, one can see, once one throws out this very, I think, kind of rigid Marxist sociology. At any rate, so these people are united against royal taxation, but these coalitions, as he shows, break down very quickly as the revolution advances. I mean, there's some precedent for this analysis, in older Marxist work. Albert Saboul talks about a broken alliance between the sans-culottes and a revolutionary bourgeoisie in Paris and elsewhere. And I'm not sure if anyone reads Denis Rohanoff's work on the Directory. I think it's an excellent work, but he shows that after the terror and the installation of the Directory, it's essentially the French Revolution becomes, in a way, what it always was, a bourgeois revolution, and their values in respect of management of the economy and also of economic management become ascendant at this time. One thing I really, I kind of forgotten about Steve's work, but I think is so interesting, is the account he gives of how this initial alliance between the National Convention and the center in Paris and these local Jacobins and their clubs, I mean, who during the terror, they're asserting their power in pretty impressive ways and threatening to make political gains that can lead to redistributive powers. These are really easily reversed. And I think Steve is quite eloquent about how fragile this alliance is. As a student of Isser Wallach, who wrote on the kind of afterlives of Jacobinism after the terror. I would like to hear a little bit more on these Jacobin clubs, just because I think it's a story that's maybe not told as much as it should be. At any rate, I guess what I'm getting to here is that this is a book that's steeped in this Brennerite account. It motivates it, it propels it, and it's kind of analytical based. Nevertheless, because it adopts some of the research and observations arising out of revisionist accounts, it kind of shows a way out of the impasses of both accounts. I mean, I think it's unquestionable, at least to me, it's unquestionable, some of the work that the revisionists question, this kind of, their right to question it. There was like a really crude Marxist sociology that underlay a lot of it. And there's also a kind of an insensitivity to the symbolic dimension of politics. And Steve talks about the symbolic dimension of the politics of the revolution, more than I had remembered, when I read it a long time ago. On the other hand, Steve, in his analysis, he redresses, or he provides an antidote to, the allergy or their total indifference sometimes to material questions. I mean, I think this is actually more the case. We could talk about this among American scholars of the revolution, or scholars working in the American context. For instance, Albert Cobbin, Alfred or Albert, I'm forgetting. I think it's Alfred. In his book, in Interpreting the French Revolution, he actually says, he doesn't say that we should get rid of the social interpretation of the revolution. He says we should just come up with a better one. Steve has come up with a better social interpretation of the revolution, I would say. Furet, I mean, he's a kind of arch enemy of a lot of Marxist scholars, but, Hegel's view, it's basically Hegelian. He speaks over and over again in Pensée la Révolution Française about this mismatch between a rapidly developing 18th century society and a kind of sclerotic French state. At any rate, I want to close, I hope I have a little time here, by just posing a few questions, particularly about the Brennerite economic analysis that I think you can address in the Q&A, Steve. The first is, one could, I think, plausibly interpret the late 18th century downturn in Languedoc not simply to stalled growth in agricultural productivity or no growth in agricultural productivity, but rather a decline of textile exports to the Levant. This is something that Jeff Horn talks a lot about, and also Christopher Johnson talks about in his book about textile production in Languedoc. And there's a way in which sometimes I feel that the Brennerite analysis is a bit too fixated on agriculture. So, for instance, to return to the textile industries in Languedoc, Christopher Johnson shows very convincingly, a little bit in his book on the life and death of industrial Languedoc, but also in an earlier article there, that in fact, in the 18th century, there is a fair amount of capital investment going on, a capital accumulation investment, and some pretty remarkable gains in productivity. And it's only the fact that industry is harmed by the relaxation of the Colbertist, quality control regime, that this export-led economy tends to fail, or failed in this case. And I think that the Brennerite account, it is a very kind of serial account. We have essentially an agricultural revolution as prerequisite for further phases of economic development, urbanization, rise of manufacture, commerce, things like that. But in Smithian accounts, I think can help amend this serial account by showing how lack of internal demand or high transport costs can be mitigated by manufacture and foreign trade. And there's some reason for believing this might have happened had the agriculture, the Languedoc textile industry prospered longer than it did, or more consistently through the 18th century. We have accounts, I know you criticize Hoffman, and I have criticisms to make of Hoffman as well. I actually have a student who wrote a wonderful dissertation dismantling Hoffman's account and showing there was actually a lot of investment in the Parisian basin. At any rate, work by Renan Labade or Morisot. For them, this is kind of massive, growth of cities like Paris or Bordeaux, to a lesser extent Nantes, can ultimately lead to a pretty substantial development in the countryside, in the hinterland. And this is the case with France. I mean, in France, this definitely happens despite low urbanization rates. I agree that there's a phenomenon in France of a kind of enclave economy. There's a lack of regional integration, but you do have the example of the Paris Basin. And, I think it's indisputable that rates of agricultural productivity in the Great Paris Basin are fully competitive with what you find in the Low Countries and in southern England. So I think sometimes a more regionally sensitive approach can be of more use. And in general, in the Brennerite account, I feel like there's too much of a contrast, this is implicit in what I just said, between England as fully capitalist and France as the non-capitalist place. And, perhaps more attention to foreign trade and also an attention to regional differences would be helpful. At any rate, I'll stop here. I don't want to go on too long, but thank you very much, Steve.
All right. Now, Xavier, I don't think I can hear you, but can the rest of you hear me? Terrific. All right, so I'm Kent, and I've got two tough acts to follow here. So, and I'll try to be relatively brief with what I want to say, so I don't repeat. Although it's impossible not to echo what Paul said, is what a delight it is after all these years to come back to Steve's first book and find that it's become, with the the approval of Brill and Haymarket, become a kind of a classic in our field. It's very deserving, and it's brought me back. Whether you think 2008 is a long time ago or just yesterday, I can remember very vividly. I think I commented on the book at a conference. That's when I first met Steve, and we bonded immediately over one thing, which was a profound admiration for lineages of the absolute state, and a bafflement as to why, in fact, it had so little resonance in the French historical studies world, with its its capture of once and for all of absolutism. And so we bonded over that, and then of course studying the book gave me a second reason to admire it deeply, was that it was rooted in the political Marxist Brennerite tradition, and yet it provided something new too. I'd already been a long admirer of work on France from this particular school of thought, which went back a long time, of George Communel's book. And I want to mention the name of David McNally here, too. His wonderful book on political economy in the 18th century is still just a terrific reading of a great superstructural moment. But the thing that really struck me about reading State and Society in 18th century France was that Steve took us right into the revolution. I think that the political Marxism has long been saddled with a kind of a reputation it doesn't deserve, which is having scorn for political revolutions and their role in paving the way toward capitalism and the other. And there's statements that came from Brenner himself suggesting that if there's one thing capitalism it didn't need a bourgeois revolution to begin with. But then as Brenner, who turned around and gave us, Merchants and Capital, a spectacular reading of the English Revolution as precisely a bourgeois revolution. But so it goes in particular, isn't it? And I won't go over the same ground that Paul just covered, but the terrific thing about Steve's analysis of Languedoc and its placement in a larger analysis of the moment of truth for French absolutism is he took us onto the terrain of the revolution, not trotting out the sort of classical. I don't know if anyone really offered ever a class that kind of that sort of dummy, a classical version of the bourgeois revolution, but his was certainly not. But what it was a tremendous reading in terms of social class, of the outbreak of the revolution and much of its course too. So this has turned into a pretty formidable research program with all of the subsequent publications that were mentioned at the outset of Steve, who's shown a marvelous ability to write with others, something very difficult for me to imagine, to write with other scholars too in collaboration, right down to his and Xavier's book on the transition to capitalism in France, which might be the last word in a certain sense of providing an overall history from the political Marxist perspective, a kind of a stunning account of above all the role of the revolution from above in France in the Second Empire, which coincided, of course, with the unifications of Germany and Italy and the restoration in Japan and the unification of the United States, all at the same time, as part of an international wave of what we might perhaps still be allowed to call bourgeois revolution from above. So in any case, I just want to point out a couple further things that we can talk about I hope in our Q&A. Is I did have I haven't published this yet, but I did have the great prod or impetus of going back to Steve's work and Xavier's work that was provided by the opportunity to write a very long review essay on Bill Sewell's book, which is a very, very important book. There's no question about this, not least for the boldness and bravery with he utters the M word, Marx, and just says that Karl Marx is, in fact, when all is said and done, is the key to understanding the importance of the French Revolution, which Bill Sewell also restores to a place of sort of winning centrality in all of modern history. And one thing to say about Bill's work is he's not alone in this. I've been trying to write I hope it's for historical materialism, a review essay on the return of Marx and the French Revolution as a topic, above all in Anglophone writing, which is a bit of a shock, of course, because again, for everybody that was alive in 2008, which is why I felt so lonely and why I was so happy to meet Steve, that was at the moment of kind of maximum ascendancy of some kind of revisionism, which was never one thing, although it always had a single emblem, and that was Tocqueville, of course, a symbolic figure par excellence here. And it's a really stunning turnaround to find in a world awash in Tocquevillism in Anglo-American historiography of France in 2008, to find that he's virtually been supplanted by Marx, of all people. And Bill Sewell's work is a kind of a high crest of a world of I would say Marxism writing on 18th century France and the French Revolution, it's a very striking wave. I don't know if Paul would accept that he belongs to this wave at the outset. I would certainly put his books into this category. I would include Jeff Horn to some extent. But adjacent to Bill Sewell's writing, there's of course Rafe Blaufarb's rewriting of the French Revolution in terms of a great demarcation, and rewriting of what he says literally was once called the transition from feudal law to capitalist law as a great demarcation, which has plenty to say about Marx and revisionism too. At one end of the spectrum, there's a book like Rebecca Spang's History of Money and Stuff in the French Revolution, which disavows the problematic of a transition to capitalism and is pretty chary about uttering the word Marx, but of course it can't avoid this in writing a very large and important work. At the other end of the spectrum, there's Charlie Coleman's The Spirit of French Capitalism. Whatever you think of it, it's an extraordinary attempt to deploy Marx and Benjamin for the purpose of placing them at the center of an interpretation of, just like in Bill Sewell, of capitalism. And that's the most extraordinary thing, is when you say Marx, you are restoring capitalism. And maybe the French world's been behind. By 2007, 2008, you didn't have to read the tea leaves to see that capitalism, both by Marxists and non-Marxists, was returning to the top of the agenda. But in any case, it's very much there now within the world of French historical studies and Western society. But with Steve and Xavier at the vanguard. The one thing I want to say, just by way of provocation, is to say our work isn't done here, though, in returning to where we say capitalism, we say transition. And it is wonderful to have the transition back in some sense. It is, as I say, for the Marxism writers, with the possible exception of Paul, transition is something that is not particularly interesting to Bill Sewell, nor really, I don't think, to Charlie. But from the Brennerites' standpoint, and that's what's stunning about the story told by Xavier and Steve in their book, is to provide an entire history of the transition to capitalism, for instance, secular, that stretches from the 16th and 17th century right down to the 20th. That is a reminder that among neo-Marxist accounts of the transition that allegedly have been allergic to the notion of bourgeois revolution, there's something that hasn't even come up yet here, but deserves to and needs to, and that's, of course, the world system approach, descending from Brodel, who poses a problem that's interesting to talk about here: the alleged poor relationship between France and capitalism over a very, very long period of time. But there's the inheritance that descends from Brodel to Wallerstein to Giovanni Arrighi, who has his own gigantic theory of the transition from Genoa and Venice, hegemonic states from Genoa and Venice to Holland and the United Provinces, to the United Kingdom, and last to the United States, which again has always been a scandal for us who work on France, is to figure out exactly where does France fit into. That's it. Those are a set of very large questions, but they only point to even deeper ones that would be marvelous to discuss if we do have the time here. And it has to do with a concept that is central to most of this writing, but not all of it. It's a highly contested one, and that's the concept that comes down from Part 8 of Capital, of primitive accumulation. That is specifically disavowed by Bill Sewell, and his book is flushed down the oubliette as always a mistake to imagine there was such a thing, which I tried to criticize him for without much success so far. I think, and I would like to know what everybody else thinks about this from a political Marxist standpoint or otherwise, that what is really most needed now is a very serious theory as to what primitive accumulation amounts to, based, as I think it should be, on the insights of Marx in the final chapters of Part 8, final chapters of Capital, but that's brought up to date from a Brennerite standpoint, from a world systems standpoint. It points to a couple deeper problems that I would like to talk about, and this is the right company to do it too, since we've already touched on that. When we think about the kind of focus on Britain and France that was inherited from Mark Locke by Brenner, it's impossible not to think also of that, I think it was Engels who put this most dramatically, that there's a strange division of labor in the transition of capitalism, in the division between England and France, and in particular, the fact that England accomplished a transition to industrial capitalism at precisely the same moment it was engaged in a life-to-death war with France, which had accomplished a political revolution, which is it's what Sewell highlights as the fruit of capitalism in France. It's what, in a very different way, I think that Steve gives a wonderful explanation of too. But how to account for that division of labor in the transition to capitalism in Europe is very difficult. It's one of the great challenges for any larger theory of how Europe gave us capitalism. It's not the only one. If we have world enough and time here, I would love, in a group of admirers of lineages of the absolutist state, to point out that what I think is one of the most peculiar things about its reception is that the book began and ended, it was fronted and ended with a theory of the transition to capitalism in Europe, which is never fully fleshed out, but there's a lot of meat there, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, has been nearly 100% ignored by everyone else on Earth. And that's the theory that capitalism, the transition to it, the way that Europe got there first, was the fruit of what Anderson calls a concatenation of a revived slave mode of production in late medieval and early modern Europe, and that without the revival of a dormant ancient mode of production in the middle of a feudal world, you never would have had the transition to capitalism that we had in the early modern period, in and through the absolute state, which featured social formations with every variety of interrelations between capitalist, emergent capitalist forms and residual feudal ones. That suggests a complication of the way in which capitalism came about, which is very, I guess what it suggests is we all probably wish that Anderson had published the analysis of the transition to capitalism of the same depth and kind that he did for the transition from antiquity to feudalism in the earlier work on passages. But while we're all waiting for that, it's fun to speculate about this. But in any case, that's enough to throw it out on the table here, at least to suggest that one of the reasons to be grateful for Steve's work and Xavier's work too is for the provocation that it suggests. It invites us, it gives us a stunning interpretation of French history over the long term while constantly inviting us to look beyond France. So I'll stop at that point.
So, yeah, I guess I have questions, or comments, which I could respond to from Paul. Yeah, so Paul mentioned two scholars he mentioned in particular were Johnson, who's writing on industrial Languedoc, and Morisot on the Paris Basin. And it's true. It's true. I just thought of it now, and it is something that I don't account for well in the book, is the obvious capital accumulation, investment in production. And one way I would account for it is what Xavier argues in his book, The Making of French Capitalism. The difference between investment as an opportunity and one as compulsion. And the British economy, well, Kent Wright mentioned the book, Venality, his book on the political economy and early modern Europe and the birth of capitalism, that the French writers of the 18th century were acutely aware of England, the physiocrats. Their whole theory of the economy was based on what they thought they perceived in England, right? Or what they perceived in England. And it was obvious to the French public, the economic defeats and the humiliation, right? And what was it about the English economy? And so investors, politicians, they knew about the gains in agricultural productivity, and after 1750, important technological gains of the Industrial Revolution. And no doubt, textile manufacturers in Languedoc could take the gains from the early Industrial Revolution in England and employ them in France, which is probably what happened, and what Johnson documented in his book. Now one thing I think you alluded to this, but I think it bears repeating, Paul. Is the closing of the trade to the Levant, which led to industrial decline. I think Johnson's book actually is the subtitle is about industrial decline, right?
Yeah, it's the life and death of
Yeah.
industrial Languedoc. Yeah.
And an important event is the closing of the Levant trade to French exports. But that begs the question, what about an internal market?
Mhm.
And I think that primitive accumulation, the last chapter of Marx,
Mhm.
is very important in this regard because
Yeah.
the English population, dispossessed, had to purchase what it needed, right? It had to purchase clothing. Across France, peasants were brewing communities, flax and hemp, right, to make
Mhm.
surplus garments for sale, to make their
Mhm.
communities viable, but also to prevent the outflow of resources on clothing they might have to buy.
Mhm.
So I think that helps explain the internal market. And I think, in fact, if I remember correctly, Johnson says that the textile industries that continued to thrive in 19th century France were the ones who had an internal market, but the military, right,
Yeah.
produced uniforms for the military, not the
Mhm.
general population.
Yeah.
Um, One could probably say the same thing about Morisot, what he documents in the Paris Basin. Um, 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 so I'll leave it. I'll leave it at that. And also for Kent, you're right. There is a striking uh, I wouldn't say upsurge, but a series of books which use the word capitalism, right? I think it's important to talk about capitalism in 18th century France, and even they'll even they'll even mention Marx, right? And not not to say that he got it all wrong, right? That there's something valuable in Marx, and especially Sewell for even taking on the issue of primitive accumulation, right? As a precondition for capitalism. Of course, he thinks that it wasn't necessary. I would hope that my work would not be a Brenner redoubt against these other accounts, but could be part of a conversation and part of a supportive movement of talking about capitalism and French political history.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
Okay.
So we do have time for a Q&A. So if anyone in the audience have questions for Steve or Paul or Kent or comments they want to make, please fire away. They're more than welcome. I will read them out loud, and then the panelists can respond and comment. So, do we have a question here in the chat? Yeah, I think we have a question. So I'm going to read it out loud. The question is: the intellectual's perspective. Would class economic relationships in the 18th century resemble a perpetual war in the same way that Vincent Brown writes about slavery in Tacky? So, Steve, do you wanna try and answer that?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but Kent Wright mentioned slavery, and and that's right. That if I remember Anderson's argument at the end of the lineages about why Europe saw breakthrough to capitalism and not the rest of the globe. I think if I recall, it was that feudalism made it possible, similar to a world systems kind of argument, because there was a room because the world systems argument is that with different states, right, that there wasn't an empire suffocating growth. And Anderson also argued that feudalism allowed for towns, right, room for capitalist enclaves, right? And in combination with the Atlantic economy and slavery, which allowed for a breakthrough to capitalism. But he also thought that, if I remember correctly, that the Roman legal past, right, the rational law, also, which Europe had, the rational legal system allowing for private property also made possible the French the breakthrough of the French Revolution.
There's an intriguing
capitalism, the breakthrough of capitalism in Europe, which makes me also think of Ray Flofar's work, where and this is where one could probably write a review which would expand the conversation. Is that his book is only about property, right? He states clearly that I only want to talk about property. I don't want to talk about the economy, right? That modern private property didn't exist before the French Revolution. The French Revolution made it possible, absolute private property. But how can one talk about the creation of property and not the economy? Right. One can't just close off the economy in the way this discussion of capitalism and the economy in the way he does in his book. So,
can I return a little bit to the question, the question that was asked about whether class relations in the 18th century resemble the perpetual war? I mean,
yeah.
I mean, I'm inclined to say no. I mean, I don't want to dismiss the question, but you know, there's a wonderful line in Alejo Carpentier's wonderful novel, An Explosion in Cathedral, and basically, it's a maroon slave or a representative of a maroon slave, you know, in the Caribbean, and saying, you know, from the moment that Europeans arrived in the Caribbean and started, you know, enslaving natives and bringing Black Africans over to slave, there was a perpetual war.
Whoops, there seemed to be a problem. Can you hear me, Steve?
Is everybody else going, but not us? Or are we going and everybody else got kicked off?
No, I don't know how that happened. I'm back.
Okay. All right. Okay. Back up.
Should I continue talking?
All right, everyone's back.
Please go.
At any rate, you know, he says that there was a perpetual war. It wasn't just like the slave uprisings of Saint-Domingue in 1791 came up from nothing. There was this perpetual war. And in a way, that's the Vince Brown's book. And, you know, I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, any comparison is useful in some way, but I think in this case, it's not necessarily useful. Like, so for instance, if you take the war on the chateau of the peasantry in France in 1789, it's really interesting because there's actually not much outright murder of seigneurs or their agents. Basically, they're there to get the paperwork and to burn the paperwork in order to undo these legal arrangements. I mean, there's almost a kind of like naive and pretty touching belief that this peasantry, and I would kind of say, you know, by kind of transitive property, all the kind of working classes of France are in some way protected by what we would call now a sort of Rechtsstaat. And there, you know, and there is something that resembles that in France, really substantially. And so the nature of the revolutionary uprising and the kind of things you saw in the run-up to the revolution, I think that they're fundamentally different from what you see in the West Indies, for instance, in slave uprisings. I mean, the whole kind of social and legal context of you know, what Orlando Patterson calls social death. It's just, I mean, again, it can be compared, but I think that the comparison shows that there are really substantial differences.
If I can follow up on that, yeah, I would say that's exactly why we need a theory of primitive accumulation, and to treat it in a really balanced way. And behind that, we need a theory of transitions. The one thing that Andersonians here would say is that he draws a consistent distinction between the two transitions he treats. And it's this, that the transition from antiquity to feudalism was catastrophic. It involved the collision. It was called by Gibbon the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And it meets every standard of war of all against all in a certain way. Out of that came the fusion of these anterior modes of production, which was really something. But there's a huge contrast with the way in which he always treats the transition from feudalism to capitalism was cumulative. It was slow. It was over a very long period of time, which involved the coexistence of feudalism and capitalism in the same social formations in a way for which there was no precedent in what came before. Now, having said that, what I think, and this is what my disagreement with Bill about primitive accumulation, and why I think it's impossible to read Marx without always being moved and thrilled by those final chapters, which are not an addendum. They are central to capitalism, to turn around and to say at the end of what is often it looks like it's a synchronic analysis, to say that no, it came into the world dripping with dirt and blood. In fact, that synchronic analysis behind it is a story of this thing that was dismissed by a set of history, dismissed by the classical political economists, which deserve to be called what it is. And what it is the accumulation of wealth that could be turned into capital by force. That's the one thing all the various items that Marx treats as genuine primitive or previous accumulation have in common: the separation of producers from their means of subsistence, but also slavery, colonies, and a host of other things that he alludes to, borders, in a couple paragraphs. But that's the difference between capitalism, in the modern world, that reproduces itself by mute compulsion without a war of all against all, with kind of a surrender, and the way in which primitive accumulation came, which is always by force. But having said that, it's the reason we need the theory is it's so various. Obviously, there was the separation of producers from their means of production, but capitalism, as we know it, wouldn't be there without your domain, Paul, without slavery. And we need a theory as to why was it possible for chattel slavery to play the catalytic role that it pretty clearly did, even for non-Marxist, or especially, you might say, for non-Marxist historians of capitalism nowadays. But that goes for all kinds of other bits of primitive accumulation, which also include possibly that whole list of items in which, as Steve just said, Anderson at the end of Lineages says, here's what the fruit of the crossing, the revival of antiquity in the Renaissance was. It was the medieval towns were just utterly different from the towns of Japan or China. The countryside was different because of the transition to absolute private property. That's where you connect with Rafe. You don't need to be agnostic about why you needed a great demarcation. But the last thing he mentions is this is why a lot of people thought he departed from Marxism into Weberianism. He cites a whole list of what we would think of as superstructural items: states, culture, scientific revolutions, religious reformation, but they're all here, waiting in some sense to be formed into a theory of the transition in all of its kind of glorious complication.
Thank you, Kent.
I could chime in on the issue of people can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the issue of primitive accumulation, because you're so William Sewell and Capitalism and Civic Equality in 18th century France, you're right. He brings it up, which is already significant. This should be the last chapter of Marx and primitive accumulation. But it says the transition doesn't happen this way. Never has, right? That's debatable, right? There probably does happen through austerity programs and IMF interventions today, which force free trade on populations around the globe. However, in France, it appears it didn't happen, right? Because the peasantry actually increased its hold on the land with the French Revolution, and then there were even more peasants. The rural population was even larger at the 19th century, right? There was more peasant population, peasant property at the end of the 19th century than in 18th century France. Now, I think Xavier's work on making a capitalist in France is important because under the Third Republic, I think it was, the redefinition of the labor contract seems very important, that many employers still purchased or leased with, and so industrialists with artisan shops throughout the 19th century. But the laws changed under the Third Republic, which forced laborers to stand alone as individuals before employers, right? In the labor contract he shows. And then another important book, I think, on this issue, which is primitive accumulation, the dispossession of people who had set their own conditions of labor, right? And then were forced to accept the labor contract with the employer under the Third Republic at the end of the 19th century. And then another important book, and you must have overseen her dissertation, Paul, Venus Beauvoir.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right? I mean, I was in her committee. She's coming back here to give a talk in a couple of weeks, actually.
Her book, Organic Resistance. And so much of the work on Morisot or Philip Hoffman is disconnected from the work in the 20th century. And she shows that after the Second World War, though much of the rural population had been drawn away because there had been substantial industrialization, better opportunities in the towns, there were still vibrant peasant communities and a lot of people farming for subsistence, right? And there were tremendous changes that were brought about around the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, from which agriculturalists suffered from primitive accumulation. They were dependent on the market and market prices and falling prices as agricultural production expanded. They had to deal with being dependent on the market, right? Which was what primitive accumulation is about. So I think that the notion of primitive accumulation, it still can be applied and be a useful category of analysis for analyzing social transformations, economic development, and transition to capitalism.
I mean, I have a lot to say about this. I mean, I gave a long criticism of Bill's book. You can find it on YouTube, actually. And I guess, I'm fundamentally in disagreement with his vision or his account of what capitalism looked like in 18th century France, and I think one thing that's really, really instructive is to read this article that David Bell wrote in Modern Intellectual History, where he said, let's take another whack at capitalism and the French Revolution. And he more or less reads chapter and verse from Bill's account, which is that the rise of this consumer economy is, this kind of consumer public, what does Bill call it? Like a consumer public sphere or something like that.
Yeah.
That is essentially, that's how we can understand the growth of the Enlightenment. And that's how we can understand the contribution of capitalism to essentially liberal norms of personhood and of universality of civic rights. So it's an enormously, well, let's say it's a kind of Marxism that is completely indistinguishable from an account that a pretty triumphalist account that liberalism offers of itself, and back to the question of primitive accumulation. I mean, I'm someone, I'm not here to kind of broadcast all my views, but I consider myself a sort of Marxisant, kind of thinker, historian about about early modern capitalism and the transition. But I tend to think in more, I guess, increasingly more Braudelian terms about it. Partly because I think that one value of Braudel's account and maybe World Systems account is that at a certain point they're kind of indifferent to the kind of Brennerite definition. You need the wage form and the generality of wage labor. But I think that the kind of history of capitalism, certainly this kind of period in the early modern period, and it reproduces itself, is that it's also capable of producing juridical differentiation, geographic differentiation, and all these things, in search of profit. And I don't actually, I have a hard time identifying a point at which that process, I mean, like, I'm also a reader of David Harvey, is kind of interested in like this kind of constant process of spatial reorganization of capital, which creates these kind of hot and cold zones where differences, juridical, productive differences are profited from. So like, I just think that, Bill's account is wrong because it doesn't understand that element of, what capitalism, if there's capitalism in 18th century France, what did it look like? Anyway. And I guess it's true that it's a little bit the issue I take with a too pure of a Brennerite account as well. I mean, Brenner, it's interesting, like Brenner basically saluted Reaganism. Like I'm totally serious. Like, the kind of Reagan Revolution flushed out all these inefficient firms in the 70s, and so the good time could roll again in the world economy. Anyway,
I will say that I'll point out that even David Bell had to chastise Bill a little bit for a too rosy celebration of capitalism.
That didn't make it into the MIH piece.
It's in his LRB,
I
his
saw
review,
Yeah.
the fashion value added. But he had to say this is a little bit too rosy, the celebration of the advent of civic equality, which, when all is said and done, that's a Tocquevillian theme rather than a properly Marxist one.
All right.
In French history, I think it just came out. I'm not sure if it's an online publication or if it's in the print form. Bell has an intervention, which is a very liberal account of the French Revolution, adopting Sewell's point of view that capitalism helped bring about individuality, a yearning for individual rights, consumerism, choice, and so on and so forth. And this led to an embrace of the Enlightenment, and hence the French Revolution as a liberal revolution, which is full circle, right? That it could be a Marxist transition, maybe not a transition to capitalism, but a liberal revolution, constitutionalism.
Yeah.
And the criticism of this liberal celebration of itself would, of course, be slavery, right? Because in the Sewell's account of consumer capitalism, how could it not encompass the sugar industry, right? In Saint-Domingue.
Sewell highlights slavery. It's fairly central to his argument, but it's not integrated into it, except for a kind of a sweeping dismissal that there's anything unusual, anything primitive or unusual about slavery. It's fully capitalist from his standpoint. So the one thing I would add here is that, there's a criticism to be made of both Bill's and I think of a pure, and nobody here is guilty of it, but of a purely Brennerite account, is that it commits you to what Anderson once called the idea of capitalism in one country, which is not very much more plausible than the idea of socialism in one country. Just as a reminder, capitalism, you can't tell the history of British capitalism or Italian capitalism or even American capitalism. It's part of it, and this is the Arrighi position. Capitalism was an international system from very early on, evolving in various ways with different centers and peripheries. But what it never was something you could tell the history of in purely national terms. And that's something that I did criticize Bill for being perfectly aware of without attempting to integrate it into his.
I mean, I would say, someone who actually, I think, hasn't been brought in this conversation, but who really should, is Jean-Yves Grenier. And it's his work on l'économie d'Ancien Régime is just a masterpiece, because I think what he does that almost no one else does is that, he sees, to speak of here, we're speaking here of primitive accumulation, like he sees the old regime French economy as like half submerged in capital circuits, in circuits of capitalist accumulation, and then half in this other world. And he's not really interested in transition questions. I mean, he's a bit of a structuralist, so it's a bit hard for him to do it. But he's interested in the dynamics, the actual economic dynamics that arise out of that. And it's interesting, he will cite anthropologists like Geertz and Sullins and things like that. And I think that, you know, if historians of the 18th century have to, instead of, I mean, I value the transition debate, I really do. But, you know, if you're interested in old regime societies and how these societies kind of in transition work, you have to understand that kind of just partial submersion in capital, but not complete, it gives way to its own dynamics. And to come back to this, you know, this criticism you made of Bill, you know, well, he doesn't take account of slavery. No, he doesn't. But, you know, people are constantly beating everyone up for not taking account of slavery.
Yeah, there's a,
you know, but if you just look in the domestic scene and take into account like what Jean-Yves Grenier has said, like, okay, processes of sort of like noble distinction, those enter into the circuit of capitalist production in France, right? And that in itself, or like for instance, the rise of coffee, you know, coffee. So there are all these cafes and things like that. But then once the hoi polloi are all in the cafes, suddenly the quality evacuates that space. And so like there's this way in which the whole process of capitalist consumerism, it creates, and sometimes either kind of moves from existent social distinctions or creates new social distinctions. It's not a uniform process of homogenization by any matter of means. And to, you know, to come back to well, maybe I kind of lost the thread a little bit here, but at any rate, I'll stop there.
No, I would just agree, but it's very, this is very difficult to theorize. We could cite someone else that we should, or another school of thought that should be in here, because it did try to theorize transitions within the limits of its structuralism, and that was the Althusserian. Lineages was written, I think, under an Althusserian spell. And hence the claim that there's a distinction between social formations, the real world of history, of the kind that, you know, Grenier's analyses of 18th century France are, and modes of production, you know, in their kind of Spinozist purity. But that in a real social formation, what you're going to see is something as complicated as this, is several modes of production in various sectors of the economy. Under the spell or the domination of a single one at different time. But that's a structuralist statement. When it becomes a moving target, then you're in the world of, although we all say this all the time, we say there's capitalism with American characteristics, capitalism with Chinese characteristics. It must have been even more complicated in the 18th century during the high transitions.
That's what's so interesting and valuable about Grenier's work, also as a work of sort of intellectual history, because he goes through all these old regime economists, Turgot. He also talks about Smith, but he talks about why they have, from the point of view of Ricardian economics, really insufficient accounts of value and price formation. And he doesn't use the word, it's kind of weird, because he's essentially giving an Althusserian lecture symptomale of the political economy of the time. Like they're theorizing over an economy that has lots of incomplete markets, right? And this is why they can't theorize the whole thing correctly, right? And to go back to Bill's book, you know, what he does in his book, when he talks about the Gournay circle, he makes them out to be a bunch of liberals. But they're only half liberal. And this is what I show in my first book. Like they're interested in a certain kind of liberalism, like inside France, but then in terms of foreign trade and all these things, like they just don't regard that as a plausible solution at all. And even within France, they see that there needs to be some kind of contention with pre-existing social formations. You know, France is going to kind of catch up to England, but all that gets stripped out.
Let me say,
One day someone should translate that book.
yeah, let me say, I read it a long time ago, Grenier's book, but as I recall, he set up, his premise was one has to set up one's own model to understand the ancien regime economy of France because it doesn't fit the classical, the model of classical economics. And
Right.
one of the reasons he states, I think, in the introduction, it's right there, is, and this sends us back to primitive accumulation, is that a labor market didn't exist, right?
Mhm.
He doesn't, it's not a Marxist analysis, Grenier, but that's one reason one can't use classical economics to understand the ancien regime economy of France. Now,
Right.
it's funny, it's interesting because in trying to find a reviewer for Sewell's book, I sent it to Grenier. He was supposed to review it, but he never did.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I sent it to Kent. He wrote a brilliant review, which I hope is published because it was a brilliant review. I didn't send it to you, Paul, because you share the same university with him. I thought that might
Yeah,
be
that wouldn't have been great
yeah,
for our
unethical, right?
relationship.
And let me
You
come.
know,
Let me
I
come
mean,
into
by the way, he knows my criticism, but it's true. You
yeah,
can't write a criticism of someone in your own.
yeah. And let me say about Althusser, because Althusser, he actually wrote an essay, you probably all know about it, on the origins of the French Revolution, which are exactly the same pretty much as Communal. It's an essay on Montesquieu,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
In which he
Yeah.
says that the bourgeoisie and the nobility form part of the same intermediary powers, a non-capitalist ruling class. And I should also point out before we leave here that both Kent Wright and Paul Cheney have written brilliant analyses of Montesquieu. Kent Wright in a compilation of essays published like 2006 or 2007 with North Carolina Press, edited by Jay Smith, and Paul Cheney's book, Globalization and the French Revolution.
Okay. We don't have any more questions from the audience at this point. Do you want to add anything, Paul, Kent, at this point? It's been a great discussion, I think, really interesting one. Steve, anything else to add? We're
Well,
past.
how about you, Xavier?
I've been taking notes. I've got a lot here, but it's not very well organized. So I don't think I will formulate a question at this.
I mean, it does kind of, I think there should be some roundtable on this again. I mean, it's sort of perennial. It's like you use the same title for a roundtable that recurs every 10 years, Capitalism and the French Revolution, or Old Regime Capitalism, something like that.
Old regime capital.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I do have a question, Steve, for you. I'm curious, what would you say your most recent book on feudalism, venality, and revolution? How does it build on your first book? And what's new? What new ideas do you think you bring? How would you connect the two? Well, we can hear you. Your microphone is off. Okay.
So I guess what I would say is that it's fully in line with the first book, right? I guess it would be building on it and be an analysis not of Languedoc but all of France. It doesn't have as much, thank you, economic history as the one under consideration tonight, but it shows how important Montesquieu's intermediary powers were to the dominant classes of France, particularly the nobility, venal offices and seigneurial jurisdictions, and that these prevented, and that reformers within the absolutist state, they knew that this was the problem and why they couldn't raise enough revenue to compete with Britain internationally and militarily. That the dominant classes were invested in the intermediary powers, not in the economy, and they tried to get them out of it by diluting the powers that venal office holders and lords had by creating a non-venal administration of provincial assemblies and of village municipalities. They were called village assemblies, in which people would hold positions by election and consensus and not by right. Right, but I show how important the intermediary powers, extra economic authority, was to the nobility, because the provincial assemblies of the monarchy, though they offered liberal means of participating in the regime were rejected across the board by the nobility, lords and office holders, right? Because they depended on intermediary powers. So I'm not sure that it's a groundbreaking development on my first book, but it illustrates some of the important points in it, let's say, across France as a whole. Because actually, I could say that Languedoc is a pays d'etat with estates, right? Whereas provincial assemblies didn't affect those pays d'etat, Burgundy, Brittany, Languedoc. The provincial assemblies were only in the pays d'election, which was most of the realm, which didn't have estates, right? So it's the other part of France, let's say.
All right, thank you. Paul, Kent, anything else to add? Any comments or questions? Are you good?
No, I think that's
All right, okay.
No, it's been a great treat. So
And let me thank you all again for participating and doing this with me. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve Miller, Paul Cheney, and Kent Wright for this great conversation. You should all check out Steve's book, State and Society in 18th-Century France, which is out with Haymarket, available. You should go to their website and get a copy. But thank you so much for there you go. Thanks so much for this great conversation. I think it was very interesting. Quite clearly, you all had really good points to make, and it's an ongoing conversation, hopefully, and I'm sure it will continue in the future in other venues. So thanks again so much for being here tonight for this event.
it's good to see you guys.
It was great.
yeah, likewise.
I think Steve is out.
Steve left. Okay.
Steve's left the building already, but yeah, this is a lot of fun. Very
I
stimulating.
think it was great.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Is it
Right.
possible to know how many people watched it? Do we know?
Are you there, Paul?